Hi, everybody. My name is Latisha. I am a screenwriter, a DEI educator, so a diversity and inclusion educator, and a podcast host. My podcast is called Interspectional. And in Interspectional, what we do is we focus on having intersectional, introspective conversations about speculative media. So, in layman's terms, it's nerds talking about nerd media through a social justice lens. So it is with this background that I actually want to talk to you about something kind of important. So I want to talk to you about the ways that we can actually engage in content that we see as problematic or whose creators have since turned out to be problematic people. So I have a couple of tips and tricks that I want to show you guys, and I look forward to sharing them with you now. So first of all, so here we go. Engaging in problematic content, how to engage in things that make you want to burn everything to the ground. First of all, two truths. So let me explain what this means. You have to be able to hold two or more conflicting truths at the same time. So this is one of the things that can be really hard and can be a really challenging concept for a lot of us. So I want to give you some examples by what I mean. One truth is I hate raw tomatoes, like with a burning passion. Another truth, I love tomato products. Those two ideas seem to conflict, but they are both true at the same time. Here's another example. Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse are some of the most beloved characters of all time, across generations. This is one of those things that is fundamentally true. What is also true? Their animation, creation, and portrayal was based on Blackface minstrel characters. So how do you balance that? And if you look at some old Bugs Bunny cartoons, they are very racist. How do you handle that? So this is one of the things that we kind of have to deal with, that Bugs Bunny is really funny. Bugs Bunny also has a racist history. Last one. Star Trek, the original series, was revolutionary for its time in terms of diverse casting and inclusive ideas. This is absolutely true. So much so that even Dr. King allowed his kids to watch Star Trek because it showed an inclusive future. And he was the one who talked to Nichelle Nichols and got her to stay on the show, since he was one of the first non-stereotypical characters on television. That being said, Star Trek, the original series, was also highly xenophobic and misogynistic. Both of these things are true. And so when we're looking at content that's problematic, we're often holding two different conflicting truths at the same time. And you have to understand, while both may be true, they also don't necessarily negate each other, which can be troublesome. So when we're thinking about engaging in content that we think may be problematic, one of the most important things is identifying the problem. Why don't I like this? What exactly is the problem? So my example for this is actually The Princess Bride. Everybody loves The Princess Bride. I know. I hated it for such a long time when I was in middle school. Probably because they just showed it ad nauseum. But I had to take a closer look at this and figure out what exactly was my problem. And then I figured it out. My problem was Buttercup. My problem was I felt that she was too passive. She, being the only woman in the major cast, was the only, I realized later, representation of a female presence. And she did not seem like me, and not just in physical appearance, but in the way she solved her problems or didn't solve her problems, seemed very, very passive. And once I identified that my problem was actually Buttercup and her portrayal, I began to actually appreciate the rest of the movie. I began to see, oh, this is funny and this is enjoyable. And then I got to re-examine Buttercup and see she was making choices within a limited context, and could appreciate her in her own way. But I had to identify what was my problem first before I even went on that internal journey. And honestly, some of it did probably have some levels of internalized misogyny. Another question to ask when you're looking at this type of media: What did it mean / historical impact? Blade Runner, another movie that I am not the biggest fan of. Blade Runner is a legendary sci-fi movie, and its impact is undeniable. The impact of Blade Runner includes having incredible visuals that still influence sci-fi today, visuals that are inspired by the 1927 film Metropolis, and at its heart, asking questions about the nature of sentience and existence. This is a really interesting and impactful movie in modern sci-fi, produced in 1982. Problems, and there are plenty. It's a very 80s movie. Particularly, many 80s movies is a very dubious, if I'm being generous, relationship with consent. And this movie is no exception. It plays on the xenophobic fears of Chinese and Japanese economic power and influence, which was definitely something big that was coming in the 1980s, especially with more Japanese and Chinese technology, electronics, cars, and people and jobs being outsourced. There were these fears that people had of Chinese and Japanese culture. And our arrogant hero is a straight up murderer. The arrogant hero is something that is kind of famous, if you will, very popular in American media. This guy straight up kills people. Granted, these people are machines, but as the argument goes in Blade Runner, if they are sentient, if they have the desire to live, the desire to care about others, the desire to care about themselves, does it make a difference? So, Blade Runner, but an invaluable impact on the sci-fi landscape that we still see today. Also, even when it comes to something that is relatively modern, that we might not think has much problematic issues, like Insecure with Issa Rae, Insecure would probably influence comedy and the portrayal of Black women for at least the next 10 to 20 years. But if we go back into the roots of how did this even come to be, you'll find things that might turn up some issues. So for instance, Insecure would not be where it is without Girlfriends on UPN, which would not be where it is without Living Single, which was on Fox in the early 90s, which owes a lot of existence to a different world, which owes a direct correlation to the Cosby Show. Boom, we hit a huge landmine. Cosby Show owes a lot of existence to Good Times, which was one of the first times you saw a Black family that had both a husband and a wife. Good Times owes a lot of existence to Julia. Julia, who was one of the first times you really saw a Black family, even though it was just the two of them, Julia and her son, which owes existence to Beulah, the first television show to star a Black woman, which partially owes existence to Amos and Andy. And both Beulah and Amos and Andy have some highly problematic things that we will talk about. But as you see, the development of these shows does have a long history. And you're thinking about the history and you're thinking about either problematic content or even current content, you cannot deny that the foundations of it might have some issues that it's worth investigating. So I want to look at Amos and Andy and the Beulah Show really quickly. So Amos and Andy and Beulah. Amos and Andy as a television show was produced in the 1950s, so 1951 through 1953. Amos and Andy originally started as a radio program, and while the actors who played Amos and Andy on the TV show was Black, on the radio they were played by, just like Beulah, two white dudes. And not only were two white men the voices of Amos and Andy, they even traveled around in blackface. Amos and Andy was one of the earliest sitcoms to pioneer so many things when it comes to television, and this is where its roots are. Beulah also originally a radio program, was voiced by this white man, Marlon Hunt. So it can be very easy to dismiss both of these. They were highly criticized for showing just caricatures of Black people. They, of course, were, like I said, steeped in the Blackface tradition, which, if you have forgotten, was actually one of the most popular forms of entertainment in America for over 100 years. And it can be very easy to just want to, dismiss them as not having any worth. However, you'd be missing a couple of things. Amos and Andy, for instance, ran for nearly 40 years, from 1926 to 1960. There are plenty of people still alive who still remember Amos and Andy, who still remember who still remember being around the radio with their families and listening to this program. And the same white men who started it were the same white men who ended it. It was one of the first comedy radio series. Its structure is steeped into a lot of our sitcom structure today. Definitely inspired by Blackface minstrel shows, and was arguably the most popular radio show of all time. You have to remember, you're talking about a time, 1926 to 1960, where there were often very few televisions, where radio was still a major form of entertainment. Amos and Andy helped shape people's idea of comedy, people's idea of who Black people were, people's idea of the structure of what was funny. And so that has a reckoning. The Beulah Show, originally voiced by a white man, Marlon Hart, eventually was taken over by Black actress Hattie McDaniel. And if you remember, Hattie McDaniel, yes, is the same Hattie McDaniel who played Mammy on Gone with the Wind. But Hattie had a long career, was honestly a respected actress despite the stereotypical roles that she was forced to play. It was the first national radio show with a Black woman lead. And when it got translated from radio to TV, it was also the first to star an African-American actress. It, in a way, was definitely revolutionary, and yet still steeped in stereotypes. The history of it is still important. Is it worth a watch? I'm not sure, but it's definitely worth the knowledge of knowing where our modern media has come from. So another thing to look for when you're kind of engaging in problematic media is, why am I watching this? / what am I looking for? Content warning for the next bit. It's a doozy. So just trust me on this one. Birth of a Nation. If you have never watched Birth of a Nation, you don't have to, and it will hurt your soul. At least it hurt mine. Yes, that is a Klansman on a horse, pulling the horse back like Lancelot, and yes, he is the hero of the story. Yes, the KKK are the heroes of the story. Why am I showing you this? Here's the thing about Birth of a Nation. Impact. It pioneered the use of close-ups, fade out, the use of extras, large battle sequences, and many others. It is fundamental in our understanding of how to use film as an artistic medium. It was a technical marvel of its time. It was one of the first to use quote unquote realistic storytelling. At 3 hours at the time, it was the longest movie ever made in 1915. Completely silent. And like I said, a technical marvel. If you watch it, you will absolutely see things that we still use today. It was the first movie to screen at the White House. Let me repeat that. It was the first movie to screen at the White House in 1915. It is the highest grossing film ever until Gone with the Wind in 1939, nearly 20 years later. So this movie had a 20-year reign of being the highest grossing, most seen film in the US. So we're talking 1915 to 1939. We are talking, that encapsulates, as we remember, the Roaring 20s. That encapsulates part of the Dust Bowl. That encapsulates so much of American history and the early shaping of who we are in the 20th century. Just sit with that for a minute. Problems. Well, everything. Everything is wrong with this movie. As you can imagine from the picture. The Klansmen are the heroes. Hugely, highly offensive portrayals of Black people. It's just awful. It's just awful. Directly inspired the resurgence of the KKK, and in fact was used up until the 1970s as a recruitment tool by David Duke for the KKK. So there's that. In response to the negative reaction that it received from the NAACP, because please don't think people took this sitting down. It was definitely protested against, unfortunately unsuccessfully. D.W. Griffith released the film Intolerance the following year and said that the people who were protesting were the real intolerant ones. Bet that sounds a little familiar. Intolerance, also a technical marvel. So both films are preserved at the Library of Congress and the National Film Registry. So that means Both of a Nation and Intolerance by D.W. Griffith are preserved forever as a fundamental part of our national culture. So if you decide to never see this movie in your life, I completely respect that. But it is one of the movies that the Library of Congress decided that it was representative of American culture. Well, one of the many representatives of American culture. Do with that what you will. For some lighter fare. So part of the story is I actually was on a podcast to talk about The Incredible Hulk. And I had never seen the first Incredible Hulk movie from 2003, but I had seen the Incredible Hulk movie from 2008. So my question was with these two movies, because I had heard that the Hulk was bad, but I hadn't actually seen it. So in engaging in this content, I had a couple of questions to ask myself. Was it actually a bad movie? Like, I had to go in really critically. Was the Hulk actually a bad movie? And if so, why? Themes, characters, special effects. So I'm analyzing what makes it bad. And then how does the Incredible Hulk respond to the Hulk? Now, these movies are 5 years apart, dealing with the same subject matter. So they do relate to each other. My big question was, what does the Incredible Hulk change or fix or adjust about the Hulk? And what could I identify that made one more successful than the other? So that made what is arguably a bad movie, The Hulk, really interesting for me to watch. Because I was wondering what was done poorly. I was wondering why did I think the director or the writer made these decisions? What could have been improved? And so when you're thinking about either problematic or even bad content, sometimes you're thinking about what is the what's the analysis I can pull from this? And that can help make something a lot more enjoyable, because instead of just sitting there to enjoy it, you're sitting there to investigate it and find, nuggets and find things that are exciting. It becomes almost a treasure hunt. So yeah, that's one way to also engage. Reflection of its time. This falls under many things. Many pieces of media are just reflections of their time. Doesn't mean you excuse their problems, but it does mean that it's worth looking critically at them. So for instance, His Girl Friday from the 1940s. I love this movie. Here's the great thing about His Girl Friday. Impact. Archetype for screwball comedy, precursor to romantic comedy. It portrays its male and female lead on equal intellectual footing, which was rare at the time. Also, an early showing a woman with a career. Hildy is absolutely a career woman. She's smart. She can handle herself. Like, this woman is impressive. And you can see why she and Cary Grant they battle and balance each other. And it's fascinating to watch. It also has some of the fastest dialogue ever recorded. Like, if you ever have a chance to watch it, it's so worth seeing. That being said, problems: xenophobic language, misogynistic language, classist, and a questionable relationship foundation. Like, she was his apprentice. Possible abuse of power. We've got lots of questions. And so I rewatched this movie recently, and I was able to pick up on some of the xenophobic language that I'd missed before. And you have to, kind of think about what was this era. Not that it was okay, but if they were dismissive of Eastern European people who were Polish, if they were dismissive of they're dismissive of one of their other female characters who doesn't have as much power as Hildy. There's all of these things that I can watch and look at and see in Sweden, like, wow, this really says something about, in this movie, what this society values, or what in this time, people were able to get away with or say without repercussions, because it was kind of in the zeitgeist that what they were saying was either generally true or generally accepted. Doesn't mean that it's right, but it is something to think about. I still think that this movie is worthy of watch, but I can't deny that there are some things about it that are problematic. Golden Girls and the movie mid-90s. Now, everyone loves the Golden Girls, or a lot of people love the Golden Girls. Here's why it's here. Golden Girls was made in the 90s, period, right? And it is full of inappropriate fat jokes. Fat jokes are quite popular, often said by Sophia and said by, at some points, all the other women in the house. There are other inappropriate jokes that they say. Now, they were definitely written to be funny, definitely got a laugh at the time, and definitely were kind of dismissed as, oh, it just is. Wouldn't necessarily fly now. But of that time and in that time, while, yeah, still wrong, was generally accepted in that period. And now the premise feels a little outdated. Looking at the ages of these women, they're, besides Sophia, they're all in their early to mid 50s. That doesn't read as old for us these days. Halle Berry is in her 50s. So is Jennifer Lopez, and so is Regina King, and they're still kicking ass. So we're like, what is this Golden Girls thing doing? It's kind of confusing at the moment. Anyway, mid-90s, the movie. So this was a movie written and directed by Jonah Hill, but it was about the mid-90s, made in 2018. So if you're gonna do what is essentially a period piece, having accurate language makes sense. So in that sense, the dialogue in this movie uses the word gay as a synonym for uncool. So the kids are often saying, oh, don't do that, that's gay, or something like that. And while completely inappropriate, and almost no child would say that now, I distinctly remember as a child of the 90s, that being just thrown around very commonly. It's a fairly accurate depiction of the time and the way that language was used. So if you are going to engage in this content, and hearing that can definitely ding in your ears, there's a question of, is this just appropriate for the time itself? Which I would argue that it is. But that's all a decision that you would have to make on your own. All right. Problematic people. The other thing that can just burn everything to the ground when we're looking at problematic content. So, Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling. Whew. So, when it comes to Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling, you cannot deny the impact of this particular franchise. Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling, by extension, helped to create the modern entertainment as we know it. You can arguably say that all of the searching through books for content and comic books and adaptations, while there always have been, the rush to get those materials and then produce them when it already has an established fan base is something that really kicked into gear once the Harry Potter movies came out. Because before the Harry Potter movies came out, the Harry Potter books had an enormous fan base, international. The person who could get Harry Potter and adapt it successfully was guaranteed a hit. And when someone is guaranteed a hit, when someone feels that the formula works, well, what they do after that is replicated, which is the world that we're living in right now. Also something to consider. Harry Potter is one of the highest grossing franchises of all time. Highest grossing between the books, the movies, merchandising, etc., 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 expansively. There's no way to understand the 2000s without understanding Harry Potter. And the first Harry Potter movie came out in 2001. Iron Man came out in 2008. Arguably, Harry Potter laid the foundational groundwork for the MCU. Because before Harry Potter, if you had a movie with several sequels, they usually stopped at a trilogy. Or if it was a horror movie, then you had subsequent movies, again and again and again. But it was often a quick reboot. You have the same villain, but different characters. Same villain, different characters that they're killing. But with Harry Potter, it was one of the early times that you really had a movie that built upon itself and that you had to watch previous movies to understand what was going on. And there was the sequence of that of when it came out. The Harry Potter movies were a commitment. Most movies up in that time were not that big of a commitment. Even Star Wars, you had at that point 2 trilogies, many years apart, but one trilogy and the next. Harry Potter let us people know that they could do it differently, and they have ever since. Now, problems. JK's anti-trans stance has soured the franchise for many. And there's been several close reads into Harry Potter that have highlighted certain things that are highly problematic in the text. But this JK stance has been the thing that has really ruined it for a lot of people. So the question becomes, what do you do when the creator of the thing you love disappoints you? That can be a really hard question. Also, what do you do when you have this thing that you love and now you realize that the person who created it is kind of a monster? Hitchcock's films are legendary. Hitchcock himself is a jerk. There are also problems with people like Picasso. So we have to really think about the art that we consume and the problems that come with it, and sometimes the problematic people that come with it. Does it mean that we don't engage with it? I don't know. But I do feel that we have options. So let me describe what I think some of our options are. To quote Walt Whitman and almost every joke dude that you ever met, do I contradict myself? Very well. Then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Walt Whitman. We and the pop culture that shapes our society are large and full of contradictions. Making peace with those contradictions can really open up the world that we live in. So one of the questions is, how do you make peace with it? And I won't lie, it can be really hard. But here's some things that I have figured out that work for me. Here's some options. 1, refusing to engage in problematic content. That is a completely legit way of going about it. If you decide you're not going to engage, then don't engage. I probably will never watch a Woody Allen movie in my entire life because there's lots of because. You can research it on your own time. 2, engage in a specific way. I know people who will refuse to give J.K. Rowling another dime, but Harry Potter is so precious to them that they may choose instead to continue to engage in Harry Potter fan fiction, or go to the library and not buy any of her things, but go to the library and get that and get those materials that way. Some people are like, I've already bought this stuff and it's mine now. So I will use it, but I will not support her any further. Depends on what works for you. Engaging with a critical eye. What does this tell you about society then and now? So just like with some of the movies that I mentioned, looking at them critically, looking at them like, okay, I am not okay with all the ideas being spouted by this piece of media. I do not condone them, but this piece of media was important. This piece of media had a place in society. So it's worth me critically analyzing it and also seeing what the people may have seen with this at that time. All of that might help me see both the good and bad of this particular piece of content. 4, look at the history that built it. Nothing is built in a vacuum. Everything has context. So sometimes the media that we see is a reflection or reaction to the times that it's in. So understanding the way that some movies were a reaction to world wars, or understanding how it may have been a reaction to changing economic times. All of these things create a feedback loop, and understanding them can help put the problematic content into a frame that allows you to understand it better. Accepting something has problems, but acknowledging its merits. Sometimes our favorite things are like that we can say, wow, this thing had so many problems, but there are a couple of things about it that were really good. Or even a lot that was really good, but these problems, cringy, but I can acknowledge them. And sometimes, if it's a favorite, if it's nostalgia, if it's something that you weren't aware of, there's a problem at the time and now you see it, but you still think it's worth your time, sometimes you have to turn off your critical eye and remember who you were when you first read or saw it. That is also an option. Not for everything, and I wouldn't recommend it for everything. But I would say that when you're looking at stuff, it's worth it to sometimes remember who you were and where you were when you first watched it. It can make whatever you're watching a lot more livable. So those are my thoughts and theories when it comes to engaging in problematic content. I hope that you found this useful. And if you have any questions, you can absolutely contact me. I am on the interwebs, so you can find me on Twitter at Latisha Creates. That's LETICIA_creates at Twitter. And I would love to talk to you then. Thank you so much for listening. And I hope if you are engaging in some more problematic content, you're able to either be critical or understand its merits, or if you must, turn it all off. This is what we do when the things we watch make us want to burn everything to the ground. I'll see you later. Bye.